Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Real American History. I'm your host, Tess Evans, public historian. And today I will be talking a little bit about Native American boarding schools in America and the concept of cultural assimilation. Now, we know throughout the 19th century that white settlers and the American government basically believed that the only way to coexist with natives was to, quote, kill the Indian, save the man, which was a phrase that Richard H. Pratt, who I'll bring up in a few minutes again, said in relation to cultural assimilation. And that's the process of becoming similar to others by being forced to adopt the other group's way of life. And Pratt and so many others thought that if they could just kill the essence of the natives, destroy their culture, then they would be left with a people who more or less resembled the anglicized version of what the white men were actually trying to do. One of their goals was to, of course, get the natives to speak and act like the white man. And one way they did this was by creating boarding schools, sometimes called residual schools, you'll probably hear that term as well, in which native children were actually forced to assimilate. So from the early to mid 19th century, all the way to the 1960s and 70s, white men would go to these reservations or wherever a native was living, and sometimes by force, take these children to attend these boarding schools. And they would stay there until they were 18. And they more than likely did not see their family in that amount of time. And we're talking, kids of every age, up until 18, of course, were brought in. And I couldn't imagine, not seeing my family for however many years, for, 10, 15 years. And parents weren't even allowed to visit these schools. That's how strict they were. And one of the major things that happened to the children was when they arrived at these schools, their hair was cut. And that's a big deal because in the Native American culture, for a lot of tribes, the symbol of the long hair resembled strength and dignity. And of course, that's what was being taken away from them. And the hair was kind of made to just resemble the anglicized version of white men's hair, so just very short. They were also put in these military-style uniforms, and some of the teachers of these schools were actually very unsavory characters themselves, either worked with the church or were hired from the federal government to become teachers of these schools. And some of them even told these kids, and we're talking 5, 6, 7 years old, who couldn't really possibly grasp what was being said to them, but they were told that if they didn't convert to Christianity, that they were going to burn in hell. I couldn't imagine saying that to any child at all whatsoever. But it was a fear-mongering tactic. And, the whites had the law on their side. I'll give you an example. There's a treaty in 1868 that was signed between the Navajo and the U.S. government that basically solidified the act of the assimilation for kids. So they were pretty much allowed to do this. There was one school called Carlisle in Pennsylvania, which was run by Richard H. Pratt. So here he comes again. So under Pratt's direction in this school, the kids could not speak a word of their own language or else they would be punished. They'd be hit with rulers, they'd be made to do all kinds of different chores. And there was another boarding school, there were several, there was about 25 in all, but there was another boarding school in Haskell in northeast Kansas, which is now a university. But there was this jail-like structure that was there, and kids were forced to stay in that jail, almost like solitary confinement, as punishment if they celebrated or practiced any part of their own culture or religion. And unfortunately, there was a lot of emotional and sexual abuse of the kids in these schools. If they tried to run away to go back to their families, like a few did, and a few others tried as well, they were caught and whipped, and they were made examples of. Other punishments were things like having to hold a dictionary on the top of your head for a very long time, or were made to, stand on their knees for a long time as well. Now, maybe the only positive consequence of these schools is that they strengthened the relationships between natives and tribes. They formed alliances to try to stay strong and get through what they were being forced to do. And that was important because the kids who were coming into these schools were not just from one tribe. They represented all tribes that existed then in North America, in America. And they were all just strewn together in these classrooms. And, we know throughout history that certain tribes labeled others their enemies, and there was a lot of tribal warfare. But this stopped in these schools because they had to stick together to survive. Today, it's estimated that nearly 70,000 kids were forced to assimilate into the white man's world. And now, fortunately, America is starting to admit their mistakes and issue apologies and reparations to Native tribes. And there have been legislation passed, like the Indian Civil Rights Act, court cases, and different leagues that have been established to stop these acts and return children to their families. And so that happened kind of, 60s and 70s or so, in the 1960s and 70s. And children definitely wanted to be brought back to their families, of course. And I just can't imagine, how this kept happening through the civil rights movement. But again, that's why there were so many other legislation establishments, all kinds of things that, really helped try to put families back together again for Native Americans. So that is it for this episode. Thanks for joining me. I will post some links and a wonderful, brilliant, albeit sad, documentary through PBS about the Native American boarding schools in the description. So until then, I will see you all on the next episode. Thanks. Take care.